Welcome to NOAA Live. My name is Grace Simpkins, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. This series is sponsored by NOAA's Regional Collaboration Network, which is spread across the country and helps connect people to all that NOAA does. It's also sponsored by Woods Hole Sea Grant, where I work, which is located at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution here on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. NOAA Live webinars will be offered most Wednesdays during the school year at 4 p.m. Eastern. And I'll just say it now, we are off for the next 2 weeks for the holiday, but we will be back the first week in January. To get more information and to find out what's coming up, you can visit our webpage or you can follow us on Facebook. Now, this series is designed to help you get to know NOAA and some of our incredible experts. All of our speakers work for some part of NOAA, which if you're a regular, you know is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Now today, it's my pleasure to be introducing you to David Whitting with NOAA's Restoration Center in Long Beach, California. Now, while we'll be talking about NOAA's role in abalone restoration, we want to recognize that we are all coming to you from the traditional lands of Native communities who have substantial traditional and local knowledge and much to share with us. We acknowledge that David is coming to us from the land of the Gabrielina, the Tomva, and the Keys people, and we are hosting this webinar from the ancestral lands of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhedaquina. A few guidelines before I hand it over to David. You are all muted because we have a lot of people on the line. However, there's a box where you can write your questions. So please let us know if you have any questions during the presentation. I'll be keeping track for Dave. We encourage you to write them as they come up, and then when he pauses, I will bring up the questions that you've put in that box. We might not get to all of them, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. All right, enough of me talking. I'm sure you want to hear from the real expert here. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thanks very much, Grace, for that great introduction. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we do with abalone, but I'm going to start with kind of more of a history of me and how I, went from being a fourth grader, like all of you or some of you, and to being a marine biologist in California. So we're going to start sort of looking at my journey through developing into a marine biologist. I grew up in upstate New York where this red pin is, and I was a fourth grader, started out being fascinated by water and everything that lives in the water, but I was far from the ocean, but still very interested in pursuing a career that involved life in the ocean. Now, I lived about 150 miles away from the closest ocean, so I really didn't get to visit the ocean very often, but I spent a lot of my time around lakes, streams, rivers, whatever water I could find, examining the life that lived in those systems. When I graduated from high school, I went to college, not by the ocean, but actually on the south shore of one of the Great Lakes in upstate New York. This is Lake Ontario. It's a huge lake, 65 miles across, so big that you can't see across it. So it feels like an ocean, but it's still a lake. After I graduated from college, I moved to Long Island, New York, where I lived for about 2 years studying seabirds and the fish that the seabirds interact with, working for the National Audubon Society. There I spent a lot of time on the ocean and around the ocean doing that work. But I really wanted to pursue those studies further, so I decided to go to graduate school, where I moved to southern New Jersey and lived at a marine field station in Tuckerton, New Jersey. And here you can see that I practically lived in the ocean at the end of this big salt marsh peninsula right inside the inlet to the Atlantic Ocean. While I was at graduate school at Rutgers University, I spent all of my time thinking about ocean life, the interactions of fish and invertebrates and their habitat, and working on these pretty much 100% of my time. After I graduated from graduate school, I then moved to Sandy Hook, New Jersey, and continued these studies at the National Marine Fisheries lab in Sandy Hook, New Jersey. And this is the first time I worked at a NOAA lab. Now, once I worked there for a few years, I had the opportunity to move all the way across the country to California. And so here I am now in California. So all these red pins are basically the path I took to get from being a fourth grader in upstate New York to a marine biologist in California. Now in California, I live a bit farther from the ocean, but my work is all in this whole area. So we have here in California a series of channel islands. These are all these islands offshore. I've worked on all of them. Also, I've worked along the coast, and much of the work that I do involves kelp forest and particularly abalone. So now here I am. This picture was taken just a few weeks ago, doing my work in my office in the Pacific Ocean studying abalone. We'll get back to the details of this picture in a bit. Now, before I really get into abalone specifically, I want to talk a little bit about kelp forests in general. And I think that some of you may have seen a talk earlier that talked about kelp forests. This might be review, but kelp forests are a extremely productive and diverse habitat that is extends all along the California coast. Anywhere that there's rocky bottom, there is the potential for kelp forests. Now, kelp forests are beautiful. They have an enormous amount of life on them, and they have a lot of different types of kelp that make up those forests. In these two pictures, you see the most common Southern California kelp, which is called giant kelp. But there's also, and here's another giant kelp forest. There's also another kelp called elk kelp that makes a similar forest but has a very different look. Now, in these kelp forests, you can find over 100 species of fish and many hundreds of invertebrates in these. And these organisms can be large and impressive, like this giant sea bass, which I believe some of you may have learned about in an earlier presentation. They also can be, small and delicate looking, or even smaller. This is about a 6-inch long fish that is quite common in some of the deeper kelp forests in California. But they have a huge diversity and color and behavior. So there's a no end of entertainment watching and learning about the life that live in these kelp forest habitats. There's also some really interesting fish that have unique ways of living. This fish here in the foreground is called a torpedo ray. It has an organ near its head that can produce an electric shock that is strong enough to knock out a person. And this is how they catch their prey. They sneak up on them, they give them a little electric shock that stuns them, and then they are able to eat them later. There's also the cute harbor seals and sea lions that come and check us out while we're doing our work. There are delicious lobsters that we see frequently, as well as this small Garibaldi fish. And the Garibaldi is actually the California state fish. And when they are babies, this is a baby Garibaldi fish, they are incredibly beautiful with these cobalt blue dots and orange background. And there's some really funny looking guys like this sheephead, which have a very powerful jaws and huge teeth that they use to crush sea urchins and other invertebrates that they like to eat. So because there are so many species and organisms that live in this kelp forest, there are certain species that really help to allow so many things to live together in a sustainable and in a stable way. And one of those is the abalone. So that's what I'm really here to talk about today. So this is a white abalone, the federally endangered one, but there are several other species. And I was wondering if any of you, particularly those from California, know how many species of abalone there are in California, or even if you know any other species that do live in California.
All right, so this is Grace from the chat box. And so the question was, do you know how many species of abalone there are, particularly how many there are in California? And then also, we have a few questions that came in about the animals in the kelp forest. So after we answer that question, you might want to answer a few questions. But so to those of you that are watching, do you know how many different species? Was that your question, or what the name of the species are?
Well, either way, you know, if they know any other species, or even just how many species in California.
Okay, so Carol says that there are red and white, so that's 2 species.
Okay.
So do people think that 2 is the number? Does anyone have any other guesses? How many different species of abalone do you think there are? Don't be shy. Let's see. This is uncharacteristic of our audience. They are being a little bit shy today. Okay, so Mitsuko says maybe 7 species. Texas says 6. So we've got a guess of 2, we've got 7, and we've got 6. So
well, those are all really good answers. There are 7. So 6 is super close. And the 2 species that are mentioned, red and white, those are 2 of the 7 species. So in a sense, all those answers are correct in one way or another. So as I mentioned, there are 7 species of abalone in California, and worldwide there are many hundreds of species of abalone. But California has one of the highest number of species all in one place. Now this panel here, I only have 6 of those. I have yet to dive in Northern California, which is where the flat abalone exists, and so I have no pictures of the flat abalone. Maybe if I do this in the future, I'll have one. But in here we have our friend the white abalone, which we saw in the previous picture up in the top right, and then now right next to the white abalone, there's a black abalone. Those are the 2 ones that are protected by the Endangered Species Act. Both of them, their populations dwindled to a point where they needed that extra protection. They also are the 2 abalone that exist in the most different habitats. The black abalone live in areas that are what we call intertidal, which means that when the tide is out, they're actually out of the water. They only are in the water when the tide is high. The white abalone occurs in water as deep as 200 feet. So they have a huge difference in the habitat that they live. Now they both live in kelp forests, just different depths. And then on the next panel, we have green and the red abalone that was mentioned by one of the listeners. And then on the bottom, there's a pink abalone, a pink abalone and a pinto abalone. And I also have some shells that I want to share. And I guess I'll turn this off for a moment.
And Dave, I'm going to cut you off. Sorry. Before you get to your shells, can we take a few questions that the attendees have about the kelp forest and what you've said so far?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, so if you have questions, you can go ahead and write them in that question/chat box while I ask the ones that I've already gotten. So Nikki is wondering, what's your favorite animal that lives in the kelp forest?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I have a number of favorites. It's hard to pick just one. There's a kind of fish. It's actually a flounder. It's called a CO turbot. And we really love seeing them because they're a small fish, but they're super curious. So they always want to come over and see what you're doing. They have these big buggy eyes that have a lot of personality to them, and they're super fun to see. Now, of course, everybody loves giant sea bass because they're so impressive. We've seen ones that were 6 or 7 feet long. They're also quite curious, so they'll come over often from behind, so that you suddenly see them very close, and they can be a little bit startling, but they're amazing. So those are probably 2 of my favorites, but there are many others that are all sort of equally amazing.
Excellent. Okay, we have a question from Liam, and Liam asks, what's your favorite abalone? Do you have a favorite species of abalone?
Well, white abalone are my favorite to find because they are very rare. So it's super exciting to find a white abalone. When we find 2 in a day, it's a exciting and amazing day. So I would say that they're probably my favorite from that perspective. But I also really like pinto abalone, which don't get a lot of press on. They're sort of a undervalued. The degree to which they're cool is undervalued because they have the biggest geographic range. You can find pinto abalone in Southeast Alaska, and you can find pinto abalone in central Mexico. Pinto abalone are also really beautiful. They have a very sort of colorful shell that has a lot of red and green in it that sort of is different and makes them stand out from the rest. Other questions?
Yes, I have just one more question for you before we move on. Sorry, and a couple people asked this. So Brennan and Michelle asked this. I know you're going to get to it, but can we eat abalone? So without giving away the rest of your talk, you can answer that really quickly.
Yes. Although I'll elaborate a little bit. Yes, abalone are eaten. Right now, you can't catch abalone and eat them. They're all protected from that. But there are farms that grow abalone and sell them, and you can actually buy abalone directly from the farms, or you can. There are some grocery stores that sell abalone, and a few restaurants that will sell them that get their abalone from the farms.
Great. All right. Well, I'm going to save any questions that we have right now and let you continue on because I know you have some beautiful abalone shells to show us.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to just go through these shells really quickly. And I actually have a flat abalone shell, so I have all 7 species here. I think I'll turn this off for a minute. So I'm going to start with the flat abalone. It's one that I didn't have a picture of. This is not a great shell, but it is a decent representation. These are super flat, as you can see. They're sort of oval and very flat, and they have a lot of these holes here. Okay, and these holes, all abalone have these holes. This is the thing that makes abalone sort of unique among snails. And abalone are a snail, believe it or not. They don't look like a normal snail, but they are indeed a snail. And these holes that are along here is really what makes an abalone an abalone. And the holes are used for bringing air through their gills to breathe. They also release their waste through the holes, and they release their eggs through the holes when they reproduce. So they're multi-purpose ports that they use, and we refer to these things as respiratory ports. So if I say respiratory ports anytime in the future, that's what I'm talking about. So that's a flat abalone. Flat abalone actually rarely occurs south of sort of central California, much more common in central Northern California and in Oregon. Okay, so the next species is pink abalone. This is a pink abalone. They're a little less flat, and actually, as they get older, they get much more domey. This is a young one. They get about 3 times as big as this one here. Pink abalone, the scientific name is corrugata, which comes from corrugated, and the reason why they have that is their shell is super bumpy, so you can always tell a pink abalone because it has the most rough, bumpy shell among them. The other thing I want to point out that the flat didn't have it so much is that the interior of the shell of abalone is called the mother of pearl, and it's really, really beautiful. You can perhaps see it there. And of course, like all abalone, they have respiratory ports along their edge here. The mother of pearl is actually used in a lot of as a decoration for instruments. They inlay it in guitars and other instruments to to decorate them, and they use it to make jewelry as well. The next one is a pinto abalone, one of my favorites. Pintos are a bit domy as well compared to flats and the young pinks. As all abalone do, they have the respiratory ports. They have the beautiful mother of pearl on the inside. And this is the one that you can find anywhere from Alaska to central Mexico. They occur across that entire range. So they have one of the largest geographic range of any abalone in the world. Next is the green abalone. And this is one that occurs only in Southern California and Northern Mexico. They're what we call a Southern California bite species. They're much smoother. The shell is much smoother than some of the other ones. Similar in smoothness to a flat abalone. They have respiratory ports, just like all other abalone. And again, this beautiful interior of the shell that people use for a variety of things. And here is my other favorite abalone, the white abalone. This is the one that occurs, this also, like the green abalone, only occurs in Southern California and Mexico. And these are very domy, right? They're very dome shaped. They have their respiratory ports are raised, and they're also quite big. If you look at those ports compared to a green abalone, they're much bigger. And so that's one of the ways that we can identify these in the field. Next, the other federally endangered abalone, the black abalone. This is the easiest one to identify of all the abalone because it actually is the color that its name comes from, whereas a lot of the other ones, it's hard to figure out why they call them what they do. They are extremely smooth. The ports, they're barely raised, and the interior of their shell is more uniform in color. There's less pink in there. It's really much more uniform. And then finally, the world's biggest species of abalone, the red abalone, and this is about maybe half as big as they can get. These get to be 11, possibly 12 inches in diameter. These occur throughout California and in Oregon. And they were a big part of the fishery, and I'll talk of the commercial fishery, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Of course, they also have these respiratory ports. And red abalone are generally have this kind of banded red and light colors, and this banding you see here, actually I should have mentioned this in some of the other ones, the banding has to do with what kind of algae they were eating. So if they're eating a lot of red algae for a period of time, they'll have these red bands, but then if they might eat brown algae for a time, which creates a lighter band. So that banding pattern, it tells us a little bit about what that animal ate while that part of the shell was developing. So those are the 7 species of abalone. I'm just going to pause quickly just to see before I move on if there are any other questions about abalone or kelp forests.
We have quite a few questions, so I'm going to go through them rapid fire. I think some of them will be really quick, so we should be able to answer a lot of these. All right, so Alice is wondering, how much do they weigh?
Oh, that's a good question. So the abalone probably the shell itself might weigh half a pound or a quarter of a pound. With the meat, it might be another half a pound. So they're a medium-sized abalone might weigh between 1 and 2 pounds. A very big abalone might weigh as much as 3 pounds or 4 pounds.
Excellent. And Jasper's wondering how old they get to be.
Well, that depends on the species. The pinto abalone are relatively short-lived. They seem to live somewhere in the 10 to 14 years range. White abalone are thought to live as old as 35 or 40 years. And red abalone, the very big ones, they also are probably in the 35 to 40, if not a little older than that.
Great. And Paul is wondering, do all the species have the same number of respiratory ports?
They do not. That's an excellent question, because in fact, the number of respiratory ports is one of the things that people look at to figure out which species they are. And the best example is the flat. If you look at the flat, there is a whole series. There's it's hard to count backwards. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's 8 open pores here, right? Then if you look at the red abalone, there are only 4. So there's a great difference between species and how many ports they have. And in fact, between individuals, some red abalone have 5 ports and others have 4 ports. So there's a little bit of variability there too.
Excellent. Now this next question, because you mentioned mother of pearl, Alice and Paul are wondering, can abalone make pearls?
That's a great question. Yeah, they can make pearls. Their pearls are a little different looking, and they don't make them all that often. But as you may know, oysters make pearls because they get a little grain of sand in their shell, and then they secrete basically shell material around that grain of sand because it's irritating to them, and they want to protect themselves against that irritation. So that creates the pearl. The same thing can happen with abalone. Their pearls are sometimes attached to the shell. They're sometimes not attached. They're usually not round. They're usually sort of, variable in their shape, but they can produce pearls.
Excellent. I did not know that. So thanks for asking that question, Alice and Paul. And Carol's wondering how you got your shells, the shells that you showed us, like where they came from.
Yeah. That's a good question. All the shells that I have are shells that I've found during my work. None of them I didn't kill, no abalone were killed for the collection of these shells. I spend a lot of time underwater doing my work in various parts of California, and I have a permit to collect shells to use just for this purpose, for education purposes.
Okay, one last question. We just have had so many great questions that I wanted to get your answers to, but Brennan is wondering, do you have a baby abalone? So I think the real question is, are they just miniatures? Do you have any small baby, or what do they look like as babies?
1 second.
I knew that you would have the good stuff. Thank you for asking, Brennan. I like it when people have to go into their into what they've got in their office to show us some things.
Okay, so I do have baby abalone shells, and this is a baby black abalone. Oop.
Perfect, right there.
Yeah, exactly like an abalone. It's just very small, and in fact, this one is kind of big. I have others, but I'd probably have to spend too much time trying to dig them up. But just so you know, by the time abalone are about 1 millimeter in size, so if like that big, they look like an abalone. Prior to that, they have a larval stage that doesn't look like an abalone, and they don't even have a shell. And they're not even on the bottom. They're up in the water column for about 4 or 5 days. So it really isn't a long period of time. And then at the end of that period of time, they start developing their shell. They move down to the bottom, and shortly after that, they pretty much look like an abalone, just really tiny.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad that we got to see that, because that was something I haven't seen before. So I'm going to hold on to any other questions I got.
Okay.
And we will save them for next. So I'm going to hand it back to you.
Okay, great. So now, as I mentioned, oops, hold on. There we go. And as the title of this talk said, abalone are kind of gardeners of the kelp forest, and it's their way of feeding and their behavior that kind of helps the kelp forest stay diverse. And so what I have here is a movie that's created by putting a camera next to an abalone, and that camera takes a picture every 10 minutes. And then we string all those pictures together, and we can watch the movement of this abalone over a number of days. So this particular movie, I won't play the whole thing, but it actually covers about 14 days of this abalone's life in about 30 seconds of video. And what I want to point out here is that, first of all, the abalone doesn't go very far. It stays in pretty much the same spot and waits for these pieces of kelp to come by, and then it grabs them and eats them. There, it just did that right there. But at the same time, it creates a little territory that it guards and it keeps clear. And so it's creating a little patch of open space on the bottom. So when that abalone moves to another spot, which they sometimes do, or if it dies, it leaves that open spot for kelp or other invertebrates to recruit to. And if it wasn't for that, there would be less open space for new things to recruit to. So it helps drive that diversity that we see in the kelp forest by keeping that little open area while it's using the bottom.
Dave, can I just ask you to explain to the kids what it means to recruit to a certain area?
Right, good question, and thanks. What I mean by that is that a lot of ocean organisms have a stage where they're floating around as tiny larvae, babies, and they're looking for a spot to land and then attach and start growing. And so they're looking for these open places. And that point where they come out of the water and land on the bottom and start growing, that's what we call recruitment. So they're basically making a home for themselves on the bottom. And so we refer to that as recruitment. Oh, and I should mention that this is actually a pinto abalone that we're looking at right here. And if you look at some of the images, it goes by really quickly, so it's hard to tell. But you'll see that its respiratory port has I'll stop it. These are the respiratory ports here, and it's a little blurred, but each respiratory port has a little tentacle that sticks out of it, and that tentacle is yellow. And that, without looking at any other part of the animal, because that tentacle is yellow, I know it's a pinto abalone. So sometimes it's just one little character that can sort of tell you what it is without really having to look at a whole bunch of other things. So now, in the work that I do with abalone, I get to visit some really amazing places in Southern California, and among them are all these islands, and I've worked on all of them in various abalone projects. But one of the neatest islands that I've worked on, and my favorite island of all of them, is San Nicolas Island, which is the one that's farthest offshore. It's 55 miles offshore. And if any of you have ever read the book, The Island of the Blue Dolphin, this is the island that book is based on. Now, if you haven't read the book, it's about a Native American woman that was left behind when the rest of her people were taken off the island by mainlanders. And they chose to go. Their numbers had been reduced to a very small number, and they were not doing well on the island, and they chose to go to the mainland with the mainlanders. But one person was left behind. And that's a real story. That actually happened. And this girl, who was probably somewhere around 16 years old when she was left there, she lived on the island by herself for something like 15 years and living entirely on her own. And an author, Scott Odell, found this story very compelling and wrote a whole novel about it. And that's the Island of the Blue Dolphin. Some of it is true. Some of it is sort of his imagination of what might have happened, because very little information was ever gained from this woman directly about her experiences there. But it's a really compelling book, and those of you from California probably have read it, because I know it's part of the curriculum for a lot of fourth graders in California. Now, on this island, there were people that lived there for thousands of years. And those people ate a variety of marine organisms, but a big part of their diet was abalone. And so this is a picture from San Nicolas Island, and this is a picture of one of the many kitchen middens that occur. Now, a kitchen midden or a midden is basically their trash pile. So they have a town, or they have a little village, And in that village, they'll have a place that they put all of their waste. And a lot of their waste were abalone shells because they ate so many of them. Now, and you know, keeping in mind that they did this for thousands of years on the island, living off of abalone and other marine creatures without really hurting the populations that they were exploiting. And this is, and just as an example, these abalone are mostly red abalone. In this particular midden, most of the middens on the other part of the island are black abalone, which are the ones that are in the intertidal and a lot easier to get. These abalone shells are roughly 5,000 years old. So something happened 5,000 years ago to make red abalone much more available to the people on this island. And we don't know what that was. It's really fascinating. So the other thing about abalone is that they were important as a food source, but they were also an important trade item. And the coastal tribes all along the Southern California coast traded abalone shells for a variety of purposes. They used them for ceremonial objects in ceremonies. They used them for jewelry. They used them for fishing hooks and all sorts of other things. And on this right here, you have a map here of current United States. But these dark lines are the trade routes among Native Americans for most of that western part of the U.S. And you can see that there were abalone trade all the way into sort of the central part of the U.S. So they're a really important trade item for these people for many, many hundreds or thousands of years. Now, if we fast forward a bit into sort of the modern day, abalone became a very popular commercial resource that people collected and sold the meat for food. And this sort of was the beginning of the problem for abalone, because at that time the people thought that there was no way you could collect them all. There were just so many of them, you couldn't collect them all. But they did a really good job at doing it, because this photo here, taken in about 1920, this is really only a year or two of collection. So when you go back to this kitchen midden, this is like thousands of years of collection here, whereas this is a couple of years. And you can see piles and piles of red abalone. And this went on for decades. So this is from the 1920s. Here's a photograph of a fisherman that I've worked with on a number of occasions, who worked, a lot of his fishing was done in the 60s. And this is off of San Nicolas Island, the same island that kitchen midden was. And he's lying on his daily catch of abalone. And on the top is a description of the site. And so in the photo I attached, in this photo, I attached a day and a half of diving in 40 to 50 feet directly off of the blockhouse. I only had to move my boat once for 175 dozen. And keep in mind, a dozen abalone is already 12. And then he caught 175 of those. Only had to move his boat once. On the bottom half, he said this site yielded over 2,000 dozen abalone. So that's 24,000 abalone that he took off of this site before he stopped going there. And the reason he stopped going there is because he stopped catching abalone. He moved on to another site. And this is the problem. The fishermen would go where there was abalone, catch the abalone until they were gone, and then move to another site. And I don't want to say that they were bad for doing this. They weren't trying to wipe out abalone. They just were unaware of the fact that it wasn't that it was possible to catch so many that you could impact the population. But in fact, you can. And what happened is in the 1970s, abalone became more scarce. In the 1980s, it became even more scarce. And then in the 1990s, they were so rare that commercial and recreational fishing was banned in all of California, except the very northern part where a small recreational fishery was allowed. For a few years after that, that's been closed as well. So now there's no fishing whatsoever. We have 2 species of abalone that are federally endangered, and all the other species are at a very small fraction of what was originally out there. Now, when we lose the abalone, we lose their role in the kelp forest that helps keep that kelp forest developed, healthy and diverse. And so we often see these areas that become invaded by just one species. And this is an example of that, where this at one time was a healthy, diverse kelp forest, and now we see it's covered by purple urchins. And I don't mind purple urchins, but when they become so abundant and they're not held in check by other grazers like abalone, they then graze down the entire kelp forest, and we end up with just rocks with urchins on it, which is not nearly as diverse. So I'm going to pause again because the next thing I'm going to talk about is sort of what we're doing about it and how we're moving forward with the restoration. So I want to pause and see if there's any more questions before I do that.
We do have a few questions, so thank you for pausing. So again, we'll see if we can go through some of these pretty quickly. One of our listeners is from Barbados. So Liam is wondering, are there abalone off the coast of Barbados?
There is, I believe, one species of abalone that lives in the Caribbean. I've never seen one. I think they live in very deep water. So I think the answer is yes, but I think the chances of seeing one are very low.
Thank you. And this question came from two people. This came from Texas and Evie. How do abalone grab the kelp or the algae and get it under their shell? So I thought you could just briefly describe their mouth and how they get the algae off the rock.
Okay, sure. I had a prop for that, but I think it's not here. Okay, so I'll just use the shell. So this is the shell, and abalone are snails. So inside the snail, the shell is the actual animal, right? And so it fits in sort of like this, and there's two tentacles and a foot, and basically they can manipulate the foot, the meaty part of the abalone. They're incredibly good at manipulating that part, and so they will literally reach out with the underside of their foot and press the algae to the bottom and then pull it in, and then they have a small mouth at the front that they'll then start eating away at it. So and they're also, their foot is really remarkable in its ability to stick to things. They can they can stick to the bottom to the point where it's impossible to pull them off with your hands.
I'm glad you said that because that was actually Brennan's question. Do they stick to stuff? So you answered that one as well. And then Lisa was wondering, what piqued your interest in studying abalone?
Well, I mean, I've been interested in marine organisms all my life, right? And so when I started working in the Restoration Center, one of the things that we do is we design and implement or carry out projects that are designed to recover endangered species. And so one of the things that we need to do is do projects that recover endangered abalone, like white and black abalone. So it was really through that I started getting involved in the abalone work. But once I started working on abalone, it's hard not to get caught up on them. They seem, they're a snail and it seems not that exciting. But when we do work and we survey for them, it really is like doing an underwater Easter egg hunt. You're constantly trying to find these difficult to see cryptic organisms, and when you do, it's really exciting to find them and continue to learn about these sort of the habitats they are common in, and so they're a snail, which makes them sound not that exciting, but they're really such an integral part of the kelp forest that by learning about them, you really become more familiar with the whole kelp forest.
Great. Okay, I'm going to just ask one more question and let you go on because our time is running short. But the last question I just wanted to ask is, Brennan was wondering if they have predators. So are there things in the kelp forest that are eating the abalone?
Yes, there are, and the small abalone are more vulnerable to predators than the big abalone. So when they're small, octopus, sheephead, that big-headed guy that we saw earlier on, they're a predator. Lobsters can eat abalone, and there's a variety of other fish that eat abalone. And then as they get bigger, they become, their shell is harder, they can hold on to the bottom, they become less less vulnerable, but even a large abalone can be taken by a thing like a bat ray, which has very powerful jaws that can crush their shell. So they do have predators besides humans.
Excellent. All right. I know you have some really interesting things to show us. So in the interest of time, I'm going to let you keep going.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna just I don't have a whole lot more, so I'm just gonna go through sort of what we're doing to try to bring abalone back. And a lot of this work is focused on white abalone because they are the most critically endangered, but we do also work with a few other species. But I'm mostly going to talk about the white abalone work. So the way that we bring back abalone is by basically raising them in captivity and outplanting them to the ocean. Sounds simple, but it's more complex than that. So this is a picture of a respiratory port of a white abalone releasing her eggs, and this is the first part of our restoration work. We got to get the female to release these eggs. Now, a female abalone can release between 15 and 20 million eggs. So if we can get her to release the eggs, we get a lot of eggs to work with. Once those eggs are released, we fertilize the eggs, and then the eggs are larvae for about 4 days. They settle, and then we start raising them up until they're about this size. And this is about an inch or a little bit more than an inch long. And at that stage, we move them out into the ocean to start their wild life. Now, we can't do this all in one place because we need to make thousands of these abalone in order to really try to make a difference in nature. So we work with a whole bunch of other facilities, aquaculture facilities, other labs, and distribute all these baby abalone to each of them to try to grow out as many as we possibly can. And eventually, you know, we get these collections. These are all white abalone here that were raised actually an aquaculture farm in Goleta, California. And these are all white abalone that were raised at that farm. They're right about the size that we like to start what we call outplanting them to the ocean. So we're planting them into the reef. Now, when we do that, these guys were all in a farm. They didn't have a lot of predators. They got food every day. They had lived a pretty easy life. The ocean is kind of a tough life, so we don't want to just throw them out there without any protection and give them a little chance. So we put them in these little houses here that have food in them. They have a little shelter. They're closed. They're protected from predators. And we keep them in there for about 4 weeks with food so they can get used to living in the ocean before they're really having to worry about getting away from predators and other things. And actually on the right here is one of our time-lapse cameras that generate the movie that I showed you earlier of the abalone movements. And this way we can look at what predators visit the cage, if any abalone escape, all those sorts of things. So after about 4 weeks, we lift up the side of this and we let the abalone move out into the environment. And actually we take the top off. And so this is a picture of the same thing, but with the top off. And you can see there's this, this plastic structure, and inside the plastic you see our little abalone with and you'll see a little patches of green. Each one of these abalone is actually tagged with a number. So if we find it on the reef, we know it's one of ours. And then we spend a lot of time underwater trying to find these abalone after we've outplanted them. So here I am again. This is the same picture we saw before. And we use all sorts of technology to help us in this. We have fairly simple things like transect tapes. This is a tape that we put on the bottom so we know where we're going, we know where we're coming back, and we can use it to map the bottom. We have these little mesh bags that if we find shells, we collect the shells and put them in there because we can look at the tag number in the shell and see which ones didn't make it. We use this thing hanging off my side here is an acoustic interrogator. It's a thing that allows me to find these pingers on the bottom, so we can navigate back to specific locations. And in my hand, I'm using an underwater tablet that is actually just a Samsung Galaxy or a Samsung tablet in an underwater housing that allows me to collect information on the abalone. So we use all sorts of technology, and that's partly because, as you can see, it's not very clear underwater in California. and so you can't. It's not like being on land that you can just walk over to things. You need help to figure out where you are and how to get back there. So I think that's all I have. I'm sorry, I think I went a little over time, and hopefully I have a few minutes if other people have some questions.
This is Grace from the chat box. We do have a few questions, and don't worry, we try as close as we can to be to 45 minutes, but we're always a little bit around that. So you're in good company. So we had a great question come in, and this one came from, let's see, who did this come from? And this came from Mylene. When they are babies, how do they get their shell?
Oh, that's a good question. So their shells are made from calcium, and they basically take calcium from the water that's dissolved in the water, and they build their shell from that. And in fact, for a lot of organisms that make shells, like abalone, they need very specific ocean conditions in order for that chemical reaction to work. I mean, it's basically a chemical reaction that they make happen in order to make to have their shell be produced. And with the various impacts of climate change, the actual chemical condition of the ocean is changing to a more acidic. It's more acidic than it has in the past. And in an acidic environment, they're actually less able to make a shell. And so this is a sort of a real threat. And we don't know how big a threat it is, but we know that it could get, that if it progresses, unchecked, it could get to the point where these organisms can't make their shell anymore. And actually, I should, since you asked that too, the shell is basically laid down in rows, right? So they start out, here's the original baby abalone right at the center here, and then every period of time, and it depends on the temperature and other things how fast this happens, but they keep laying down rows and rows and rows of shell, and it gets bigger and bigger, and that's how this whirl that all snails have is formed. They just keep adding a little bit of shell at a time until they go from being 1 millimeter size to this big or even bigger.
So to build on that, Robert is asking, can you use those rings then to age the abalone like you would with a tree?
Unfortunately, you can't, and that's because it isn't as regular as a tree. With trees, they have a regular annual, yearly cycle of growing that creates these rings. With abalone, it really depends on how much food and the temperature. And they can go through periods of time where there's not very much food and not grow at all. And those periods of time can last more than a year, where they're just getting enough food that they can survive, but not really put a lot of growth on. And then they can have a period of time where there's a lot of food, and then they'll grow, tremendously. So the rings are not as regular. They're not a regular indicator of any time passing that we can use to age them.
Okay, I have one last question before we have to sign off. And the last question comes from Brennan. And Brennan is wondering, how long have you been studying abalone? How long have you been researching them?
I've been working I've been in California doing marine work of various types for about 18 years. I started getting involved in abalone probably about 16 years ago.
Excellent. Well, I just want to thank you. I know that I learned a lot about abalone, and I'm sure all the kids that are watching today did as well. Really interesting footage and a lot of things that I didn't know. I have to say, I think they might be my favorite snail right now. So thanks for sharing your expertise. Thank you, Crystal and Tricia, for doing our American Sign Language interpretation. We very much appreciate that. Appreciate your time today, Dave, just really educating us on abalone. And for those of you that are interested in our upcoming, as a reminder, we do not have a NOAA Live on the next 2 Wednesdays because of the holiday, but we'll be back the first week in January. And that first Wednesday in January, we're going to be talking about whale tagging. So we have some really great footage about how we place tags on the backs of whales, and then some footage from those tags and some tracks. So really interesting stuff if you want to tune in, and that'll be in 3 weeks, I guess. But I just want to tell everyone to have a great holiday. And if you're missing NOAA Live, you can always watch one of our recordings. But thanks so much for being with us today, Dave and Crystal and Trisha. Thanks to the viewers, and we will see you later. If you want to know more, there are some abalone resources on our website as always, so you can take a look there if you're interested and want to know more about abalone. Have a great night, everybody.
All right, thank you.